I talked about these brain circuits that are involved in addiction, the poor impulse control, the opiate, and the cocaine, the stimulant circuits. I talked about the poor self-regulation of these children. So in fact, all of these childhood conditions that you just mentioned are characterized by poor self-regulation. So the question is, why are the brains of so many kids troubled these days? That's what the question is. Okay? Now, this is where the next part comes in. What I didn't know when I was diagnosed with ADD, I knew that tuning out was not a disease, but I didn't know how the brain developed because nobody taught me in medical school. Turns out that how the human brain actually develops is an interaction with the environment. So, if you take a child with perfectly good eyes at birth and you put him in a dark room for 5 years, he'll be blind thereafter for the rest of his life. Why? Because the circuits of vision require light waves for their development. So if a child may have rudimentary vision at birth, but if he doesn't have light waves coming into his eyes, even the circuits present at birth will atrophy and die, and new ones will not develop. And is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. Cognitive, emotional, and social capacities are inextricably intertwined, and learning, behavior, and both physical and mental health are highly interrelated over the life course, etc., etc., etc. So it follows that the more stressed parents are, the more stressed the kids are, and the more that's going to interfere with their brain development. I mentioned dopamine. People who use cocaine, they want nicotine, they want elevated dopamine levels. Kids with ADHD, the dextrine, Ritalin, more dopamine. You take infant monkeys and you measure their dopamine levels in the frontal cortex. It's normal, and then you separate them from the mothers, and within a week, their dopamine levels go ways down. So the biochemistry of the brain is shaped by the early relationships. So to go back to your question then, it's not that parents are different. It's not that they're not as dedicated. It's not that they're not as loving. It's that they're more stressed than they used to be. Because it never used to be the case that children were brought up in the isolated nuclear family, spending all their time away from the parents in daycares. That's a completely modern aberration in human development. Children used to grow up in the tribe, clan, village, community, neighborhood, extended family, related to a whole lot of nurturing adults. It does take a village to raise a child.
Raising my kid, I thought I had it all figured out. Love them, keep them safe, make sure they do well in school. But then I started noticing things I couldn't just parent my way through. The outbursts, the struggle to focus, it wasn't adding up. I kept asking myself, what am I doing wrong? It wasn't until I stumbled on Dr. Gabor Mate's work that I realized, maybe it's not about what I'm doing, but what the world around them isn't giving. What if the real reason behind so many struggling kids today isn't what's wrong with them, but what's missing from the world around them? And what happens when we finally realize it takes more than just good genes to build a thriving mind? Let's dive in, and together, let's navigate Dr. Gabor Mate's insights.
And the critical period for vision is 5 years. The 30 or so circuits that together make up the visual apparatus just doesn't develop unless there's light there. The same is true for the circuits of endorphin regulation, dopamine regulation, incentive and motivation, impulse regulation, self-regulation of stress. All of these circuits also need the right necessary environment. Now, the human brain is particularly susceptible to the environment because most of our development of the brain occurs after birth and not before. 80% in the growth of the brain happens after birth, and 90% of the circuits in the brain develop after birth and not before. Unlike the horse, for example. The horse can run on the first day of life. Human beings can't muster that much neurological development, muscle balance, control, visual acuity for a year and a half, 2 years. The horse is 24 months ahead of us or 18 months ahead of us in terms of brain development. Why is that? Simple evolutionary logic. what makes us human beings, in fact, is the size of our prefrontal circuits, our cortex, the neocortex. And so we evolved as human beings as our brains began to get larger. And our brains began to get larger precisely because our ancestors at some point began to use their forepaws as hands and their digits as fingers. So they started manipulating objects, using sticks and tools and so on and so forth. In order to control all that, there was evolutionary pressure for the brain getting larger, more circuits, more sophisticated circuits developing. So we start to do this. As a result, this starts getting larger. But in order to take full advantage of our capacity to use our hands, we have to walk on two legs. In order to do so, the pelvis has to get narrower, because you can't walk on two legs on the pelvis of a horse. So what we're getting is a larger head and a narrower pelvis. And that means already at birth, those who have given birth will know this, the head is the biggest diameter of the body. If our head was any larger, we wouldn't be born. So we couldn't be born at 11 months or 12 months or 13 months. We simply would not be born. We have to be born prematurely relative to other animals. And that means much of our development has to occur after birth. And that depends very much on the environment now. And it's a rapid period of growth in the first 3 years of life. By the end of the first 3 years, the human head is something like 85% adult size. The body is about 18-19% adult size. There are times in the first year of life when every second in this space of time, a million connections or millions of connections are being made in the brain. So it's a very critical period. Just as the visual circuitry requires the development, for its development, the presence of light waves, so all the circuitry implicated in childhood behavior issues, self-regulation, endorphin, dopamine, etc., they also need the right environment. And the necessary condition for the physiological development of these key brain circuits is the presence of attuned, non-stressed, non-depressed, emotionally available, consistently available parenting caregivers. Anything that interferes with the parent's capacity to be emotionally consistently available, to be non-depressed, to be non-stressed, to be attuned, will interfere with the child's brain development. Now, this is finally getting into the medical literature. I made the same point in my book on ADHD 12, 13 years ago now, because the science had already come in by then. And you know, all those years later, it's still an uphill battle to convince people, doctors, that what they're looking at are developmental problems, not disease problems. That what's actually going on is that kids don't have the right conditions for development. So instead of providing the right conditions, we give them pills. Now, pills may be useful, and I've taken them myself and I've prescribed them, but they do nothing for development. So to quote from this Harvard article of this year, new discoveries in molecular biology and epigenetics are explaining how early adversity, as a result of scarcity, stress, or instability, can lead to physiological disruptions in the developing brain, the cardiovascular system, and other body organs, as well as behavioral adaptations that have lifelong impacts on learning, behavior, and health. So think about ADHD. When a 1-year-old is stressed, and why is the 1-year-old stressed? Because the parent is stressed. To quote a psychologist and spiritual teacher, the child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he is with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. At the University of Washington in Seattle, they've done EEG studies, electroencephalograms. These are the electrical printout of the neurological activity of the brain of 6-month-old infants whose mothers had postpartum depression, comparing them to the EEGs of 6-month-old infants whose mothers did not have postpartum depression. You could tell from the EEG of the child whose mother was depressed and whose wasn't. The emotional states of the mother programs the neurological activity of the child's brain for a lifetime. Mothers who have postpartum depression in a child's first year of life, their kids will have high cortisol levels in their third year and maybe for a lifetime. Their stress regulation has really been affected. Now, to quote further from this Harvard article, from this pediatrics article, the architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth. Already what happens in pregnancy to women has an impact on the child. All kinds of studies have come in, I mean hundreds of them, that when women are stressed during pregnancy, their offspring are more likely to have behavior problems, disturbed brain circuitry. If you stress pregnant animals in a laboratory, their offspring will be more likely to use cocaine and alcohol to soothe themselves as adults. If you abuse women, their children, their placenta will have higher levels of cortisol at birth, the stress hormone, and their kids at age 7 or 8 are more likely to have ADHD. The architecture of the brain, again, is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follows. The action of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. Cognitive, emotional, and social capacities are inextricably intertwined, and learning, behavior, and both physical and mental health are highly interrelated over the life course, etc., etc., etc. So it follows that the more stressed parents are, the more stressed the kids are, and the more that's going to interfere with their brain development. I mentioned dopamine. People who use cocaine, they want nicotine, they want elevated dopamine levels. Kids with ADHD, the dextrine, Ritalin, more dopamine. You take infant monkeys and you measure their dopamine levels in the frontal cortex. It's normal, and then you separate them from the mothers, and within a week their dopamine levels go ways down. So the biochemistry of the brain is shaped by the early relationships. So to go back to your question then, it's not that parents are different. It's not that they're not as dedicated. It's not that they're not as loving. It's that they're more stressed than they used to be. Because it never used to be the case that children were brought up in the isolated nuclear family, spending all their time away from the parents in daycares. That's a completely modern aberration in human development. Children used to grow up in the tribe, clan, village, community, neighborhood, extended family, related to a whole lot of nurturing adults. It does take a village to raise a child.
I remember when my little one was born. All those cooing, gurgling sounds and the sweet smell of baby shampoo. But as the months turned into years, I started noticing some changes. My once calm and content baby seemed more irritable, prone to meltdowns, and struggled with sleep. It wasn't until I stumbled upon that article about early life stress that things started to click. Apparently, high cortisol levels in a child's first year can have lasting effects on their stress regulation and brain development. And now, looking back, I realize my own stress during pregnancy might have played a significant role. I've heard so many stories of moms who experienced anxiety or trauma during pregnancy, only to find their kids struggling with behavioral issues later on. It's heartbreaking to think that something I went through could have such an impact on my child's life. I'm determined to do everything I can to support my kids' mental health and well-being. That means creating a calm and nurturing environment, practicing mindfulness techniques, and seeking professional help when needed. It's a journey, but I'm hopeful that with the right support, my little one can overcome the challenges they've faced and build a strong foundation for the future.
In our society, because of economic and social reasons completely beyond the choice of an individual parent, kids are brought up in isolation from the larger community, and even in isolation from their parents. Parents don't see their kids most of the time. It's a completely aberrant situation. And the parents, when they do see their kids, are increasingly stressed. Why are they stressed? Because there's more demands on them. Why do women have an increasing ratio of multiple sclerosis as compared with men? Because they're more stressed than they used to be. Why they're more stressed than they used to be? Because they still play the same role that they always have of being the emotional providers and the emotional sponges for all the stresses and emotional issues in their environment, including of their men and their children. But on top of that, they now play an economic role as well, which is a major responsibility. And on top of that, they're doing so in the context of less community support, less connection. Of course they're going to have more multiple sclerosis. It's purely a stress-driven disease, which I discuss in my book, When the Body Says No. So that, and 20% of women now have postpartum depression. 20%, 1 in 5. And the cesarean section rate in British Columbia is 35%. So that early bonding is interfered with. So all kinds of things have happened to put stress on the parenting environment. It's not a question of parents not being as loving or as good. It's that they're much more stressed. And it's those stresses that then show up in the disturbed brain circuitry of the kids. And so this is a social problem, not an individual medical problem. It also means that these childhood conditions are not diseases, they are developmental problems. And if you want to help these kids, it's not sufficient to try and change their behaviors or to just medicate them. We have to give them different conditions, because the good news is that, as with these monkeys, that when you put them back into society, their dopamine receptors come back. It's the same with kids, same with adults. When they get the right conditions, the brain can develop new circuits, as for example with the mindful meditation. So the real issue in child development, in child care, or in the care of the addict, or any disturbed adult, is not how do you control symptoms and how do you suppress symptoms, but how do you help them develop. And if you're talking about developmental questions, it's not the same as trying to change behaviors. If you had a plant in your backyard that wasn't growing properly, it was small and scrawny, you could go out and yell at it if you wanted to. You know, hey, grow up already. Act your age, for God's sakes. Or you could ask yourself, what conditions does this plant need to develop properly? Irrigation, nutrition, sunlight, and so on. It's the same with kids. But on top of that, there's yet another problem with kids in our society, which is the subject of the book I co-wrote called Hold On to Your Kids, which is that children have this deep need for attachment. And this plays into addictions, by the way. Children have a deep need for attachment. In fact, they're wired to attach. So is a duck. When the duck hatches from the egg, he looks around and sees the mother duck and attaches to the mother duck, which is called imprinting. And that means that, you know, the duck will now biologically bound to follow that mother wherever she goes, he goes, which is the way he survives and learns to be a duck. But it's well known that if the duckling hatches with the mother duck absent, the duckling will imprint on what? What will it imprint on? Anything that moves, which could be a dog or a mechanical toy, none of which are designed by nature to bring up the duckling to adulthood. So developmentally, it's a catastrophe. Our kids are also wired to attach, just like the duckling, but they're not wired to attach to mom and dad. The reason being that mom and dad may die. The reason being that they have to form new attachments later on in life. The reason being that they're meant to attach to a whole lot of people. So there's nothing in the brain that says I have to attach to mom and dad. Nature just assumes that the adults will be around. It's not the job of nature, but the job of the culture to make sure that children's attachment relationships are working. But what happens in a culture that has destroyed the attachment relationships? Where people, the fishing industry goes belly up in Newfoundland and people have to move to Alberta to work in oil sands. You know what's going to happen? All of a sudden you have no relationships. The extended family, the tradition, the culture, the multi-generational connections are all of a sudden gone. And the kids don't see the parents the whole day because the parents are at work. Because they have to make a living in this stressed society. And when they come home, they're stressed. Well, the child's brain is still wired to attach, but when a kid is stuck in daycare at age 1.5 or 2 years, who does he spend his time around most of the day? Other kids. Guess what? Just like that duckling, he'll attach to other kids. He can't help it. His brain will do it for him. It's a biological drive to attach because they can't stand not being attached, because they can't survive without it. So by definition, they have to attach to whoever's around. Then they become attached to their peers. And now what that means is, now they take other kids as their models and caregivers, how to talk and how to walk and what to look like and what to be like and what's important and what isn't important. They learn language from each other, which is a result of which the average adolescent today has got 60% of the vocabulary of an adolescent 60 years ago. Because they learn language from immature creatures. And that has huge impacts on development. So in other words, to answer your question, it comes down to brain development, what promotes brain development, and the fact that the conditions for healthy brain development have disastrously shifted in our society because of the disturbed attachment relationships. And that's what I said in the beginning, that everything comes down to attachment and its disturbances. Okay? Yeah. More, if you want more on that, it's in my book, Scattered Minds, on ADHD. Or Hold On to Your Kids, which is about the peer relationships. When your caregivers hurt you when you're small, and most abuse happens in the family of origin, not because the parents are bad, but because they were traumatized themselves. And that's what we see in the First Nations population. Some of you may have seen the CBC documentary on David Suzuki's program on my work with the shamanic plant called ayahuasca. If you haven't seen it, you can Google the nature of things, the jungle prescription. Ayahuasca is a hallucinogenic plant that opens up the memory circuits. It's amazing. I'm not recommending that you use it in the right context, in the right hands. It's a real support for people's emotional insight and development. That's a whole other subject. But last year I was working with a native band until the federal government forbade me to work with it. I was working with a native band in British Columbia, highly traumatized, highly addicted. A 54-year-old woman there who's been an addict since she was 10 years old told me that the first day she got to residential school, she spoke her own language, and the kindly priests or nuns stuck a pin in her tongue to teach her that she mustn't use her native tongue. So for a whole hour, this 4-year-old sits there with a pin in her tongue, unable to put her tongue back in her mouth because she would cut her lips. This happened in British Columbia 50 years ago. Our home and native land. That's why we're seeing all the addiction rates. And of course, when people are abused in childhood, then they will very often abuse their own kids, and this is what happens to the native population. Hence you have these high rates of diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, addictions, suicide, alcoholism, so on and so on and so forth. It's nothing genetic about it, or very little is genetic about it. Even if there's genetic predispositions, they're not predeterminations. It still depends on the conditions. So when you're abused as a child, traumatized, what is your implicit memory of caregivers? Your implicit memory of caregivers is that they're not to be trusted, that you mustn't open up, you mustn't make yourself vulnerable. You have to close down, you have to detach, you have to manipulate, you have to lie, you have to hide yourself so that you won't be hurt again. If you show up not taking responsibility for your judgments, which you're bound to have, we all have judgments, and that's okay, but if you don't take responsibility for them, if you don't see them that they're about you, not about them, if you treat them curtly, with irritation, because you're not taking care of yourself, all that's happening is that the implicit memories of non-caring caregivers are being triggered, and then there goes the interaction. And that's why I said in answer to that question, the very first question, that the most important thing is how we show up for them. Not just what we say and what we do, but how we actually show up as human beings. And that depends on the kind of work and the kind of compassion that we're able to extend towards ourselves. Now, we talk about recovery in addictions or in illness. If you look at the word recovery, what does it mean? It means to find again. But if you find something again, what is it that people find, by the way, when they recover from addiction? What is it that they do find? Anybody? Themselves. They find themselves. In other words, they find themselves, but if they find themselves, that means that they never lost themselves in the first place. They just lost contact with it. But that self has been there all along. So the recovery very much is the finding of the self. Now, we have this idea in our society that in order to help people recover, they have to have negative consequences. They have to hit rock bottom. What nonsense. If living in the downtown east side of Vancouver with HIV, with terrible abscesses and hepatitis C, outside the law, in poverty, with your teeth rotting, is not hitting bottom, then what the heck is? That's not what people need. They need the very opposite. Thomas Merton, the Catholic monk and spiritual teacher, writes, in order to gain possession of ourselves, we have to have some hope of, some confidence, some hope of victory. And in order to keep that hope alive, we must usually have some taste of victory. We must know what victory is and like it better than defeat. Now, what is victory for these people? Being treated like a human being. Being mirrored for their possibilities, not just for their dysfunctions. Being accepted for who they are. And so, an organization like Casey House, which is dedicated to the healing, or at least the compassionate care of very troubled, very ill people, is a manifestation that it's not negative consequences, but real love and real compassion and real caring is what we have to offer to these people. And I will finish with a quote from the Buddha. This idea of the biopsychosocial nature of human beings and the interconnection of everything is not new. It's only of the science now to prove it, but it's not new. The Buddha had this concept of interconnected co-arising of phenomena. Everything depends on everything else. And so he wrote, or he said, 2,500 years ago, contemplate the nature of interconnected co-arising during every moment. When you look at a leaf or a raindrop, meditate on all the conditions, near and distant, that have contributed to the presence of that leaf or raindrop. In other words, a leaf contains not just itself, it's not an isolated, discrete entity, it contains the sun, the light, obviously, the earth, the minerals, the materials, the sky, the water, the irrigation. It contains the whole world. So does every human being. Know that the world is woven of interconnected threads. This is because that is not because that is not. This is born because that is born. This dies because that dies. The birth and death of any phenomena, he says, are connected to the birth and death of all other phenomena. The one contains the many, and the many contains the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many, and without the many, there cannot be the one. And there's the teaching, I think, that if our society took to heart, we would have much better results in all our treatments and caring for people, and would also have a much more humane society. Thank you very much.
Lately, I've been reflecting a lot on how I show up in my relationships. It all started with a conversation about judgment. We all judge, it's natural. But what matters most is how we handle it. If I snap at someone because I'm stressed or haven't taken care of myself, it's not about them, it's about me. It triggers memories of times I felt unseen or unsupported, and suddenly the interaction explodes. The key, I realized, is showing up authentically, with compassion for myself first. It's like recovering from something, addiction, illness, anything. Recovery is about rediscovering who you are. That core self that was always there, just buried beneath layers of stress and negativity. Our society loves the rock bottom narrative, but that's not helpful. Imagine someone struggling with addiction, living a life of hardship and despair. What they need most is the opposite, to be treated with dignity, to see their potential, not just their problems. It's like the quote I heard about a leaf. A single leaf isn't just a leaf. It contains the sunshine, the water, the earth, the whole world. We're all like that, interconnected and dependent on each other. So here's my takeaway. Showing up with compassion for myself and others is the key to better relationships, better care, and maybe even a more humane society. It's a simple idea, but one that can make a world of difference. Remember, it's not about reaching perfection, but about progress. Each step you take, no matter how small, brings you closer to your goals. Embrace the journey, celebrate your victories, and learn from your setbacks. You have the strength within you to overcome any challenge. Believe in yourself and keep moving forward. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Inside Serene, a channel dedicated to helping you navigate your healing journey. Together, we can break free from the chains of addiction and embrace a brighter future. Find your strength, embrace your journey, and create your own masterpiece.